The lawyer slid the will across the table, and I heard my own name where his son's should have been. Elena Ferraro. The outsider. The bride they tolerated because a dead man had signed for me. 8 months into this marriage, half a bargain, half a feeling I was afraid to name, I owned nothing. Now the old dons will handed me control of the entire Ferraro empire, 3 generations of money and power, meant for Dario alone. If you've ever loved someone you were warned not to trust, you know what hit me next. Not triumph. Fear. The room turned before I understood the words. Dario went still beside me, the warmth in him closing like a door pulled shut against the cold. Paper had run my life since my father signed me over to settle his debts, so I read it instead of just fearing it. It weighed almost nothing. Weeks would pass before I understood he hadn't made me an heir at all. He had made me a weapon, and I still didn't know which of us he'd aimed me at. Let me go back, because you have to understand what I was before that table to understand what the will did to me. 8 months earlier I had signed a different set of papers in a different quiet room, and everyone in that room called it a marriage. It was arranged the way debts are arranged. My father owed the Ferraros a loyalty he could not repay in money, and I was the interest. The ink smelled like nothing, and my hand didn't shake, and I hated that it didn't. I had already decided to survive this by feeling as little as possible. Dario undid that plan without trying. He was the heir, the feared one. People lowered their voices around him. I'd been warned about him the way you warn someone about a cold season: dress for it, expect nothing warm. But the first night in that enormous house, when I couldn't sleep for the strangeness of it, I found him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and instead of the cruelty I'd braced for, he made me tea I didn't ask for and set it down without a word. The cup was too hot to hold. He noticed me switching hands and slid a folded cloth under it. Such a small, disarming thing. That was the shape of us for 8 months. Small kindnesses that didn't match the man I'd been told to fear. The way he stood between me and his family's stairs at dinner, like a wall he'd decided to be. I told myself it was strategy. A man like that protects an asset, not a person. But I would catch him looking at me a beat too long, and the look wasn't strategy, and I would have to remind myself to breathe. I never had power in that world. I could not have taken anything from them if I'd tried. The Ferraro name closed over me and I lived inside it like a guest who was never quite asked to stay. Only once did the old Don speak to me alone. It was 3 weeks before he died. He sent everyone out of the library, even Dario, and looked at me a long time with eyes the exact gray of his son's. The room smelled of old paper and cold ash from a fire no one had lit. He said, "You have nothing to gain here. That is why I can trust you." I thought it was the cruelty of a dying man, one more way to name me a nobody. I said something polite and I left and did not think about it again. I would think about nothing else, later. The Don died in his sleep in the spring, and the whole house went the particular kind of silent that isn't peace. The family gathered like weather gathering. And in the reading room, the gray light coming through tall windows and the lawyer's voice very careful, the will named me. Not a bequest. Not a widow's share. Control. Controlling interest over everything the old man had built, routed through me, over Dario, the son who had bled for that family his whole life. I watched it land on them. An aunt's mouth going thin. A cousin half rising from his chair. And Dario, who had made me tea at 2 in the morning, turning to look at me with a stranger's face, the warmth gone so completely I felt cold where he'd been. The lawyer set a second envelope on the table. Sealed, heavy, the old Don's crest pressed into red wax. "This may not be opened yet," he said. "The terms specify when." He would not say more. I said, into that terrible quiet, I don't want it. Nobody believed me. I was the outsider who had just been handed a kingdom. I tried to give it back. That was the first thing I did, not out of nobility, out of fear. I understood, in the animal way you understand a threat, that this inheritance was a target painted on my spine. But the will would not let me hand it over. I sat with the lawyer for 2 hours and he showed me the clause I have since read so many times I could recite it in my sleep. Control could not be transferred, sold, or signed away by simple choice. It routed through me and only me, and the conditions under which it could pass were so narrow the lawyer himself frowned at them. Your father-in-law wrote these terms himself, he said. Against my advice. The paper was cold under my fingers. It was as if the old man had built a cage and made me both the prisoner and the lock. Dario found me in the corridor afterward. For the first time in 8 months he stood too close in a way that wasn't warmth. How long, he said, very quietly. How long did you plan this? I didn't, my father barely spoke to you. His voice was steady, and that was worse than shouting. And he handed you everything. Everything he stopped, and pulled the door of himself shut again. I don't know what you are. But I'm going to find out. He walked away. And that night, someone came for me. Not with a knife. It was quieter, and worse for being quiet, a hand over my mouth in the dark of my own room, a voice close to my ear telling me that outsiders who reached above their place did not last long in this house, that accidents found the ungrateful. Then the weight was gone and the door clicked, and I lay in the dark with my heart going like something trying to break out of me, tasting salt, not knowing whose hand it had been. I understood then that refusing the will would not save me. Only understanding it might. Here is the thing nobody tells you about being trapped with someone who hates you. Sometimes the trap is the only thing keeping you both alive. Dario did not soften. But the morning after that hand in the dark, when I came down pale and silent, he looked at me once, really looked, and something in him sharpened. That evening, when the same aunt who'd gone thin-mouthed at the reading made a remark about how fragile new brides could be, how easily they took ill, Dario set down his glass with a click that stopped the table. Elena is under my protection, he said. Anyone who forgets that will remind me why they shouldn't. I stared at him. He did not look at me. And I realized, slowly, the shape of the cage the old Don had built. For Dario to keep the family needed the inheritance, and the inheritance ran through me. Harming me collapsed everything he was trying to hold. He was protecting me because he had to. I told myself that. But he'd said it like he meant it, and I was so tired of being alone in that house that I let myself feel it, just a little, the warmth of standing behind a wall that had decided, for whatever reason, to be a wall for me. That was when I noticed the date. I'd been reading the will for the 10th time, looking for a way out, when the notarization date caught me. The clause naming me, the controlling clause, had been written and witnessed 14 months earlier. 6 months before I ever married Dario. Before I had done a single thing to earn trust or suspicion. Before, as far as the family knew, the old Don had ever spoken a word to me. I brought it to Dario because I had no one else to bring it to, and because two people trapped in the same cage eventually have to look at the bars together. He went very still over the page. That's not possible, he said. He'd never met you. Except he had. Once. In a library that smelled of old paper and cold ash. You have nothing to gain here. That is why I can trust you. I didn't tell Dario that yet. I wasn't ready to hand him the one strange thing I owned. I stopped defending myself and started looking. I didn't know yet how close I already was to an answer I wouldn't want. For weeks I had been a woman explaining she was not a thief. Now I was a woman with a question, and the question had teeth. Why me? And why before? The sealed second envelope was part of the answer. The lawyer wouldn't open it, but the will referenced it, a document, it said, that could be unlocked only by the holder of control. By me. There was a long reference number in the clause. I copied it onto my palm in ink because I didn't trust paper anymore. It matched nothing I could find. Not yet. Working the problem meant working with Dario, and working with Dario meant being near him in rooms late at night, both of us pretending the tension between us was only about the will. It wasn't. I would hand him a page and our fingers would meet on it and neither of us would move for a beat too long. He still didn't trust me. I could see him hate that he no longer entirely distrusted me either. It was Matteo who put the first crack of real fear in me. Matteo was Dario's brother, younger, easier, the one who smiled where Dario went grave. The consigliere in all but title, the one the family actually liked. He caught me alone by the stairs one night and he was kind about it, which was the frightening part. You should think about disappearing, he said gently, like advice from a friend. Not forever. Just until this settles. A woman in your position, everyone would understand. Dario would understand. He touched my arm. Let me help you leave, Elena. Before something happens that no one can take back. I almost said yes. God help me, I almost thanked him. Instead I went looking for someone who had loved the old Don long enough to know his mind. Her name was Julia. She had kept that house for 30 years, and she moved through it like a second set of walls, seeing everything, saying nothing. I found her in the kitchen at an hour when no one else was awake, and I did the only thing I had left. I told her the truth, that I was afraid, that I didn't understand what the old man had done to me, that I hadn't asked for any of it. She looked at me a long time. Her hand smelled of lemon and old soap. Finally she said, he met you before. Didn't he? Before the wedding. My breath stopped. Once. In the library. She nodded slowly, to herself. He had me bring tea and send everyone out. Afterward he sat alone until the fire died. And the next week he changed his will. She wiped her hands on her apron over and over. I shouldn't say this. But I watched that man love his son in the only broken way he knew, and I need you to hear me, because no one else will say it. She leaned close. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. He didn't name you to punish Dario. He named you to save him. The floor seemed to tilt. Every clue I'd been holding turned over at once, the impossible date, the narrow clause, the sealed envelope. You have nothing to gain here, that is why I can trust you. The will was not an attack. The will was a shield. And I had been carrying it without knowing which way it faced. Save him from what, though? That was the next rung, and it dropped me somewhere colder. The reference number finally gave. Using the control the will granted me, the thing I'd been so afraid to touch, I reached the account it pointed to, buried under 3 shell names. Inside it was a ledger. Months of it. Money had been bleeding out of the Ferraro family to a rival house. Steady, patient, disguised amounts, not a smash and grab but a slow opening of a vein. Someone had been selling the family a piece at a time, its routes, its protections, its blind spots. And the ledger was signed from inside. Every transfer carried an internal authorization, a mark only someone trusted, someone with access, could have made. I sat in the blue light of that screen with my hands cold, and I did not want to read the mark, because I already knew it would not point at a stranger. It pointed close. It pointed at someone Dario would open a door to without looking. Not the hostile aunt. Not a rival suitor. Someone who smiled where Dario went grave. I took it to Dario because I could not carry it alone, And because somewhere in those weeks he had stopped being my jailer and started being the only person in that house I trusted. He refused it. Of course he did. No. He shoved back from the table. You're reading it wrong, or someone wants you to. Not him. He couldn't say the name. His whole body was refusing it. Dario. I put my hand flat on the ledger between us. The night after the reading, someone came into my room in the dark and told me outsiders don't last in this house. They knew where my room was. They knew the wool made me the target. Who did you tell where I slept? He went white. Because he knew the answer. Only one person had asked, casually, brotherly, is she comfortable, is she settled, which room did you give her, the way you ask when you care. The way you ask when you're building a map. The aunt who'd wished me ill had done it out of old fear, an old debt, a widow protecting her own thin place in the family. She was cruel, but she was not the wound. The wound was closer. The wound had made me tea-warm assurances by the stairs and offered, so gently, to help me disappear before something happened that no one could take back. Matteo hadn't been warning me away from danger. He'd been trying to remove the one obstacle his father had built against him. I didn't know that envelope would answer every question I'd been afraid to ask out loud. We opened the sealed envelope that night. The terms said it could be unlocked by the holder of control, and I was done waiting for permission. Inside was a letter in the old Don's own hand. I had seen that handwriting once, on the will. I would know it now anywhere, the hard downstroke, the way he pressed too hard on the first letter of a name. I won't give you all of it. Some of it belonged only to a father and a dead man's grief. But the center of it I have never forgotten. He wrote that he had known. For over a year, he had known Matteo was selling Dario to their rivals, out of envy, out of the small rot that gets into a second son who is loved second. He could not prove it in time. He could not act openly without splitting the family down the middle and finishing the very war he was trying to prevent. His health was failing faster than his evidence was building. He was running out of days. So he did the only thing a cornered man who loved his son could do. He looked for the one person Matteo could neither predict nor buy nor frighten into leaving, someone with no faction, no debt to trade, nothing to gain. An outsider. A bride with nothing. Asterisk, you have nothing to gain here. That is why I can trust you. Asterisk, he had made me his son's worst enemy on paper so that I would be the one wall his enemy couldn't climb. Each thing alone had been explainable, the date, the clause, the strange sentence, the sealed envelope, the ledger only I could reach. Together they meant one thing. The old man had spent his last strength building his son a shield in the shape of a woman the family would be too busy hating to suspect. The letter ended, asterisk, the enemy I named will be the only wall he has. Forgive me for not telling you sooner. I did not have the days, asterisk. I looked up. Dario was reading over my shoulder, and there were tears standing in his eyes that he would never let fall, and I understood that I now held the power to end all of it, but only if he could do the hardest thing his world had ever asked of him. Trust the outsider. Completely. With everything. He looked at me for a long time. The same gray eyes his father had turned on me in the library, but younger, and breaking. You could take it, he said quietly. All of it. Right now. The will gives it to you, not me. You could walk out of here the head of this family and there is nothing any of us could do. He wasn't accusing me, he was naming it plainly, to see what I would do with it. Why aren't you? And I saw him then, really saw him, the way you see someone once and can never unsee them. Not the feared heir. A son who had spent his whole life bleeding for a family that resented him, standing alone between them and every danger since long before I arrived. A man his own father had loved in a broken way and could not protect out loud. He had been carrying that house on his back in the dark, believing he was the only wall it had. Because it was never mine to keep, I said. He didn't give it to me. He lent it to me to give back to you. And because, my voice did the thing I'd spent 8 months not letting it do. Because at 2 in the morning you made me tea I didn't ask for, and put a cloth under the cup so I wouldn't burn my hand, and no one in my whole life had ever done a small thing for me for no reason. I am not your enemy, Dario. I never was. Your father knew that before either of us did. He crossed the room. He took my face in both his hands, and his were shaking, and he pressed his forehead to mine and just breathed, like a man who had been holding the same breath for years. Then he pulled back, and something in him had settled into iron. Then we do it his way, he said. Quietly. In front of all of them. We don't give Matteo a war. We take away the ground he's standing on. We did it at the long table where the will had first been read, both of us wanting it to end in the same room where it began. I let Matteo believe he was winning, right up to the last hour, that the family's hatred of me was a blade he still held. He stood and made his gentle case, that control had fallen to an outsider, that the family needed to consolidate under someone of blood, under him. Heads nodded. The aunt. The cousin. It was going exactly as he'd built it to go. Then I stood. I used the control the will gave me, the one and only time I ever would, to do a single thing. Openly, in front of all of them, I transferred it. Not to myself. To Dario. Whole, clean, in front of witnesses, in the narrow way the old Don's terms finally allowed once the holder chose it freely. The kingdom I could have kept, handed back to the son it belonged to. I watched the family's map of me tear in half. And then, into the silence, I laid the ledger on the table. I read the entries aloud. Just numbers, just dates, just the internal authorizations, one after another, until the pattern stood up on its own and everyone at that table saw the shape of it. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I let the old Don's evidence do the thing he'd run out of days to do himself, and then I set his letter down beside the ledger, in his own hard hand, and let them read who had known, and how long. Matteo's leverage died in front of him. You could see the moment it went, the family's faces turning from me to him, the hatred finding its true north at last. He looked at the rivals' numbers with his mark on them and he had nothing. No war to start. No ground to stand on. No one drew a weapon. That was the point. Dario cut him off from everything that had made him dangerous, the access, the trust, the rival's coin, and told him to be gone by morning, and Matteo went, because a man with no leverage and no allies is just a man in a doorway. The quiet of it was the justice. He would live. He would simply never again be someone the Ferraros opened a door to without looking. The room that had wanted me gone sat in the wreckage of everything it had believed about me. I felt no triumph. Only tired, and something warm, standing very close on my left. I didn't know yet how long it would take that house to feel like mine, too. The house is quieter now. Not peaceful, I won't lie to you and call it peaceful. The family is changed, and some of them will need years to look at me without remembering how wrong they were. A father's last design forced all of us through a door none of us would have chosen. That cost is real, and I don't pretend it isn't. But Dario claimed me in front of them. Not the Will's bride, not the outsider they'd been ordered to tolerate, me. He stood in the same room where his father had made me his worst enemy on paper, and he chose me out loud, for myself, for the woman who could have taken everything and instead handed it back. When a man raised to trust no one decides to trust you with the whole of himself, you feel it, like a season you were never dressed for finally turning warm. I keep the old Don's letter in the library where he first told me I had nothing to gain. I understand him now. He loved his son the only broken way he knew, and when he couldn't protect him out loud, he built a shield out of the one thing his enemy would never think to fear, a bride with nothing, married into the Mafia, made into a weapon and pointed, in the end, at the only heart in that house that meant her harm. I fold the letter closed. I set it on the desk in the last of the gray light. The room goes quiet. Dario is in the doorway, waiting for me, and for the first time since I signed my name into this family, I am not afraid of what comes next. If this story pulled you in, the darkest vows are the ones made in silence, and this channel is where they're kept. Subscribe and follow Raven Vow for more stories of dangerous love and the quiet justice that follows. Tell me in the comments, if a dying man made you a weapon to save the person you loved, would you have handed the power back, or kept it?